the real Snow White, and the nobleman who tried to silence her forever. She wasn't called Snow White in the beginning. Her real name was Maria Sophia Margaretha Katharina von Erthal, a mouthful even for her time. Born in 1743 in the small German town of Lohr am Main, she was a baron's daughter, destined to live behind palace walls, under lace umbrellas, and far away from the dirt of ordinary life. But fairy tales lie, because Maria's life wasn't one of comfort. It was a maze of secrets, control, and a silence she never asked for. She grew up in Lohr Castle, a cold stone fortress with sweeping towers and windows that watched more than they warmed. Her father, Prince Philip Christoph von Erthal, was a minor nobleman with major ambitions, a diplomat, a judge, a man who played politics the way some men play chess, ruthlessly and without apology. Her mother died when she was young, and not long after, the new wife arrived, Baroness Claudia Elizabeth von Reichenstein. Sharp-tongued, sharp-dressed, and sharp-eyed when it came to the money and inheritance of her new stepchildren. Maria's world shrank. Her toys were taken. Her books vanished. Her name was slowly erased from the family's official gatherings. She was not beaten. No, this wasn't a tale of whips and bruises. But what happened to Maria was worse. She was forgotten. Her only refuge was the Spessart forest, a thick, endless stretch of green beyond the castle gates. Locals told stories of wolves, witches, and outlaws that lived between the trees. But to Maria, it was the only place no one called her a burden. She would wander for hours, pick berries, read old books she'd smuggled from the library, and whisper her thoughts to the wind because no one inside the castle would listen. The townspeople called her Snowskin because her complexion was pale as marble, her lips naturally red, and her hair black as coal. But she wasn't vain. She didn't pose. She barely spoke. She watched. And what she saw began to change her. By the time she was 17, Maria had grown into something her stepmother feared, a young woman with her own voice, and worse, with influence. Her late mother had left behind land, nothing grand, but enough. Enough that if Maria married well, she could reclaim power in the region. Enough that she could be more than a forgotten girl in a stone house. But Claudia had plans. She wanted that land. She wanted that name buried. And most of all, she wanted Maria gone. That's when the whispers started. At first it was quiet. Maria is unwell. She's been speaking strangely. The girl isn't safe alone. Then, an accusation. She was seen talking to a servant boy, without a chaperone. Then a diagnosis. Hysteria, too much reading, too much wandering, a fragile mind. Within weeks, Maria was banned from leaving the castle alone. Then her room was moved to the upper tower. Then her meals changed. A traveling doctor arrived. He examined her for 10 minutes, didn't ask her a single question, then wrote a letter. She was declared unfit for marriage and prone to instability. At 18 years old, Maria was quietly erased from noble society. But she didn't go quietly. She wrote letters, pages of them, to cousins, aunts, clergy. She wrote about the lies, the locked doors, the new pills they were making her take. Most of her letters were intercepted. But one got out, and it changed everything. A priest from Würzburg visited the castle under the guise of delivering a holy relic, but he wasn't there for worship. He was there for Maria, and what he found was a prisoner. A young woman locked in her own tower, fed half portions, denied access to visitors, withering in the name of protective medicine. He returned to his parish, wrote his own letter, and soon a noble ally appeared, Count Friedrich von Steinach, an old friend of Maria's mother, who began an investigation. What followed would become one of the most quietly controversial inheritance disputes in German aristocracy. one that the von Erthal family would try to erase from history. But some records remained, whispers from the court, secret testimonies, a royal edict sealed under wax and dust. The charges against Claudia were dropped. But Maria was never seen in public again. She didn't die. She didn't marry. She was sent away unto a cloister deep in the Bavarian countryside. There, she lived out her life behind stone and silence. No 7 dwarves, no poison apples, no magic. Just a girl with skin like snow. Silenced not by a curse, but by power. But legends do funny things. They twist. They soften. They bury pain beneath fantasy. And somewhere between Lore Castle and Grimm's fairy tales, Maria's story became Snow White's. Not in name, but in spirit. Because some stories are too dark for bedtime, but too true to forget. The cloister they sent her to was called Cloister Ebrach, nestled in the deep Bavarian countryside. It was not a prison, at least not in appearance. Tall stone walls, a chapel, quiet gardens where nuns walked in silence. It was the kind of place where secrets could rot beautifully, with ivy on the stones and prayers in the air. Maria Sophia was 20 when she arrived. She didn't resist, she didn't scream or fight, because she had already learned something by then. No one listens to the girl who refuses to be broken. She was placed in a private cell and given a new name, Sister Margaretha. To the world outside, she no longer existed. The noble family sent polite letters once a year, donations for her care, requests for prayers, the illusion of kindness. But they never visited. There was no trial, no press, no scandal, just silence. And that silence became her shadow. But inside the cloister she spoke, not loudly, not often, but to the sisters. She told fragments about the tower, the medicines, the stepmother who smiled in public and locked doors in private, about a priest who visited once and never returned. The other nuns didn't always believe her. Some said she had a touch of melancholy. Others said she was cursed with too much intelligence. But one nun, Sister Clara, kept notes, handwritten pages, hidden between psalms in the monastery's prayer books. They survived. Centuries later, when historians examined the cloister's records, they found them, cryptic but unmistakable. The noble girl from Lore speaks in riddles. Her stepmother feared her. There was land involved. There was poison, not in the food, but in the words. Meanwhile, outside the monastery walls, something strange began to happen. In the forests near Lore, old stories began to evolve. The villagers had always told tales of a pale-skinned girl who wandered the woods. At first, she was a ghost, then a lost child, then a noble woman betrayed by her kin. The stepmother became a witch. The tower became a castle. The old mirror in the Baroness's private chamber, a Venetian glass piece engraved with "Truth conquers all," became the magic mirror. And the girl, she became Snow White. Why? Because fairy tales offer comfort. And Maria's story did not. There were no dwarves, no kisses, no redemptions, just a girl who threatened the wrong person and paid the price. But fairy tales are clever. They bury pain beneath metaphor. So instead of accusing a stepmother of orchestrating political exile, they say she asked the huntsman to take the girl into the woods. Instead of revealing systemic inheritance theft, they say she envied the girl's beauty. Instead of clerical suppression, they say she bit the apple and fell asleep. It's easier that way, cleaner, marketable. By the mid-1800s, the brothers Grimm were traveling across Germany collecting folk tales, and when they arrived in Lore, they heard one particular story repeated more than any other. A girl banished by her stepmother, a forest, a group of outcasts who saved her, a spell, a return, and justice, neatly packaged at the end. They published it in 1812. Sneeuwwitchen, Snow White. A moral tale, a bedtime story, a legend, but the Grimmers missed something. Or maybe they ignored it. The tale wasn't born in imagination. It was born in erasure. The names were changed. The truth removed. But the pain, the core of the story, that stayed. Because no matter how sweetly it's wrapped, a stolen voice always echoes. In lore today, there's a small museum in the old castle. It has a mirror, and a dress, and a plaque that reads, "This castle may have inspired the tale of Snow White." But there's no mention of Maria Sophia von Erthal, no mention of Baroness Claudia, no mention of forced isolation, cloistered exile, or political inheritance disputes. Just a fairy tale, a glass coffin for the truth. But in the monastery records, and in the whispered stories that villagers still tell, Maria's name lives. Not because she was saved, but because she refused to disappear, even when the world demanded it. By the mid-1800s, Snow White had become a sensation. The Brothers Grimm's first version, published in 1812, was dark, strange, and raw. But with each edition they made changes, softened the violence, romanticized the poison, added dwarves, cheerful laborers who saved the girl and gave her a home. And just like that, Maria's tragedy became a fable of obedience. The story told girls to be quiet, to be pretty, to be patient. If you suffer, be gentle. If you're hurt, sleep through it. Eventually, a prince will save you. It wasn't just a story, it was a message, one written by men who saw suffering as something best rewritten, not confronted. And no one paid for that lie more than the girls who saw themselves in it. Because Maria wasn't rescued. She wasn't kissed awake, she didn't ride off on a white horse. She lived in a stone cell and died in silence, far from her home, her land, and the title that was rightfully hers. But you'll never see that ending in the fairy tale. Why? Because fairy tales serve the ones who write them, and in this case, they served the nobility, the church, the patriarchy. Look closely, and you'll see how the story evolved. The stepmother became a cartoon, jealous, vain, evil. But in real life, she was a powerful noblewoman who used law and silence as her weapons. The poisoned apple? Easier to digest than years of emotional abuse, medication, and psychological manipulation. The glass coffin? A poetic substitute for forced cloister life. Still, cold, and seen but untouched. The prince? There was no prince. There was only Maria, alone, writing letters no one read. This wasn't a rescue story. It was a cover-up. And the Brothers Grimm, intentionally or not, gave power what it always wants. A version of the story where it wins. By the early 1900s, Snow White had been translated into dozens of languages. Children across Europe were being raised on it. In 1937, Walt Disney gave her a voice. Bright eyes, high notes, doves and deer, and a message that echoed louder than ever. Wait, be good, be beautiful, help will come. But what if it doesn't? What if your voice is the only help you'll ever have? Maria Sophia's story was no longer hers. It was now a cultural myth, sanitized, twisted, and sold. A real girl turned into a symbol. And the symbol turned into silence. No mention of inheritance theft, no discussion of legal manipulation, no talk of gaslighting, forced exile, or female erasure. Just magic and mirrors, but the truth was never magic. It was men with power, women with ambition, and a girl whose only crime was having a voice at the wrong time. And yet, something remarkable happened. In quiet corners of history, Maria's truth survived. Historians began piecing together records, birth certificates, land documents, church correspondence. They noticed how her name disappeared from the family tree after her mother's death, how Baroness Claudia took over properties that weren't legally hers, how the church records listed Maria as mentally unfit, with no medical evidence. They noticed the pattern, and when they followed the paper trail, They found the girl in the tower. She never had a chance to write her story, but others did. And slowly, people began to realize Snow White wasn't a fantasy. She was a warning about what happens when a girl has something they want, and they can't take it while she's awake. Lore Castle still stands. Its stone halls echo with footsteps from tourists now. Children run through its courtyards, pointing at old armor and pretending to be knights. There's even a Snow White mirror exhibit in one room, a Venetian glass piece said to have magical properties, once owned by Baroness Claudia herself. The same woman who rewrote Maria Sophia's fate in ink and silence. But there's no plaque about that. No guided tour that tells visitors how a noblewoman manipulated royal law to take her stepdaughter's name off the books and locked her in a cloister to do it. Because that's not the story people come for. They want the poisoned apple, the dwarves, the kiss. Not a legal fight over land rights and a girl erased by inheritance law. After Maria was sent away, Claudia consolidated her power. She gained control over not just the von Erthal estate, but its influence. She hosted regional lords, advised on religious endowments, and ensured that no other noblewoman in her shadow ever dared outshine her. She died praised by her peers, and buried in an honored tomb. Maria? Buried in the quiet cemetery behind the cloister walls. Her name etched onto a small, unvisited marker. Her legacy reduced to whispers and footnotes. No prince, no fanfare, no glass coffin, only dirt and stone. And yet somehow, she endured. The townspeople never forgot her entirely. While the aristocracy erased her, the villagers passed her down in whispers. She was the pale one? She lived in the tower. They tried to take her land, but she wouldn't stop writing. They called her mad because she wouldn't be quiet. These stories lived not in books, but in kitchens, in firelight, in songs, and fairy tales. Grow in the dark. By the 19th century, the brothers Grimm were collecting these whispers. They published the cleaned-up version, but even they admitted in private letters that many of their stories were inspired by real events, often too grim for the page. One note from Wilhelm Grimm references a tale told in lore of a young noble girl wrongly accused and banished to a convent. He doesn't name her, but he didn't have to. And over time, the tale became something else. It drifted, wandered. Each century sanded the edges. The stepmother became jealous of beauty, not power. The tower became a forest, more romantic, less political. The dwarves became helpers, erasing the girl's loneliness. And the ending? A happy marriage instead of a quiet death behind cloister walls. Because audiences don't like stories that end in silence. They want resolution, even if it's a lie. But the castle remembers. The stones remember, and the silence inside certain wings of Lore Castle is different. Still, uncomfortable, like someone is waiting. Like someone never got to say goodbye. In 2019, a historian named Karl-Heinz Bartels reignited the debate. He published an article naming Maria Sophia von Erthal as the likely real inspiration behind Snow White. He laid out the records, her birthplace, her exile, the land inheritance dispute, the Baroness and her mirror, the proximity to the Spessart forest, the cloister burial. He didn't claim certainty. But the evidence? It painted a portrait clearer than any Disney cell. Still, the tourism brochures only mention it briefly. A possibility, a local legend, because it's easier to sell fantasy than injustice. But there are still those who go to lore not for the fantasy, but for the forgotten. They walk past the mirror, past the displays, to the older wing, and stand by the window where Maria once wrote, and wonder, what happens when a woman is erased not with violence, but with story? Because Maria's story didn't end in a forest. It ended in a room without visitors, a prayer book no one opened, and a family line that never acknowledged her again. But the truth? It waited. In letters, in shadows, in the kind of silence that doesn't disappear, it just sharpens. That they're meant to comfort children, teach little lessons, and put restless minds to sleep. But sometimes, a fairy tale is a mask. Sometimes it's a clean story placed over a blood-stained truth. And when you peel it back, you don't find magic. You find a girl like Maria. You find a life that was never meant to be remembered. And yet, it survived anyway. Not because the world tried to remember her, but because she refused to be forgotten. They moved her into silence. They cloistered her. They wrote her out of land records, stripped her of her name, and filed her away under mental instability. But even in the darkest room of the convent, she kept writing. She kept speaking, even when no one was listening. And the words she left behind? They weren't made of spells. They were made of truth. And truth, even buried, has roots. It reaches through time. It breaks stone, and it waits. Not for princes, not for saviors, but for someone brave enough to listen. Because Snow White wasn't about a kiss. It was about a girl who said no. A girl who wouldn't disappear quietly. A girl who was punished for being an heir. And a witness. She didn't fall asleep from a poison apple. She was silenced by the legal system. By a stepmother in lace gloves and a judge's seal. By a society that saw a woman's voice as dangerous. The mirror, it was real. Hung in a castle, framed in carved oak. And when the Baroness looked into it, it didn't show magic. It showed what she feared most. A girl too smart, too rightful, too impossible to control. So she called her unstable, and everyone believed her. Because it was easier to believe the Baroness than the orphaned girl who wouldn't stay quiet. It's always easier that way. But stories, real ones, don't care about what's easy. They wait. They haunt the back of libraries and crawl through village songs. They speak through broken gravestones and smudged ink in forgotten prayer books. They hide in fairy tales, wearing gowns instead of chains. And one day, when the right person opens the right page, they wake up. Maria Sophia von Erthal never got her ending. No wedding, no crown, no justice. But she did get this. A story that outlived the people who buried her. A name that centuries later still reaches us, whispers to us, reminds us that every time we tell the tale of Snow White, we should remember. She wasn't saved by a prince. She was stolen by silence, and she lived anyway. So if you're still listening, if this story touched something in you, let her name be heard again. Not as a myth, but as a girl who never stopped telling the truth, even when the world turned it into a bedtime lie. Uncle Luke closes. If fairy tales are supposed to teach us something, then let this one teach you this. The most dangerous thing a girl can do is speak when she's been told to stay quiet. And the most powerful thing you can do is remember her when everyone else forgot. So go ahead, say her name in the comments, subscribe to Uncle Luke Tells. Like this story if you're tired of the wrong people writing the endings. Because Maria's wasn't the first truth they buried, and it won't be the last. Not if we keep digging, not if we keep telling, not if we never forget.